This is the magicwordpodcast.com.
Hello, this is Scott Wells for the magicwordpodcast.com. This week we're going to talk with a author of Across the Pond over in England, Mr. Ian Keable. Typically, again, as I have said many times on this podcast, this is not a place to promote your latest trick or your movie or your TV appearance, DVD, or anything that you got out there. However, and everyone seems to be, a lot of people writing books of tricks, but whenever it's going to be something that I think would be of general interest to the group, I think, and I say to the group, there are different groups who might find interest in one thing but not another. You know, not everyone enjoys everything, certainly. But recently, I had attended the Collectors Expo in Las Vegas, which had a lot of individuals there who really enjoy history of magic. And so this week we're going to talk with Ian Keable about this book he has recently written, which is called The Century of Deception, the Book of Hoax in 18th century England. So it's a fairly specific and narrow area, the focus for this book. It doesn't talk about the 19th to the 20th century or even getting into the 21st century, but just kind of the beginning of this with some very interesting stories about how this all got started. He also talks about the difference between hoaxes and scams and cons and things like that because they are all pretty much different from one another. Again, as we had been talking about this, I thought this would be of interest to some of the listeners, if not all. And for those of you who may not find this particularly interesting to begin with, I still think you should stick with it because there are a lot of things in here I believe that would serve you well in your general knowledge of magic and hoaxes there also, because everything that we know about magic is good to have up in that attic of ours and we call a brain. So that way we might be able to call this out sometime and be able to apply some of this knowledge. But anyhow, he's got a lot of very interesting stories he pulls from this book that he will share with us, plus also talk a lot about why he had decided to bring this book to the magic community. Well, without further explanation, I'm going to let you hear it really from his mouth rather than from mine. So please welcome our guest this week, Mr. Ian Keable, here on The Magic Word. Today I have with me a guest from in London, England, and we are speaking to him in his home there. He is a member of the Inner Magic Circle. Is that right? MIMC? Or
yes,
yes, a member of with Gold Star.
Gold Star, yes,
there you go.
As well.
And performing as well. Ian Keable has recently added another name to his many credits, and that is as an author. And he has just completed a book called The Century of Deception. We're going to be talking about that among so many other things here today. So please join me with a cup of tea with my friend Ian Keable. Hi there, Ian. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm very well. Thank you very much. Delighted to see you. Across the airwaves.
Yes, I'm glad that you can make this also. This is great. Now, how long have you been a member in the Magic Circle, by the way?
A long time. I guess it must be approaching 40 years now.
Okay.
That I've been a member. I guess when I joined, they were sort of quite desperate for members, I think, so it was quite easy to join. I just got a proposal and a seconder. I didn't know anybody, but they said, "Oh, that's fine, no problem. We'll put a proposal and seconder together," and I was in fairly quickly, I think. Yeah, so we're just looking for more money, I suspect, at the time.
Well, they've been around for about 110 years, I guess, then now, and so 40 years ago, I mean, they're pretty far into it, and they were still looking for members at that time, huh? Or is it because they were getting ready to change to a new location and that's what they were needing, just some money for the new quarters?
I'm not sure, really. I mean, as you say, the Magic Circle was founded in 1905, so 115 years ago now. When I joined, it was, we were still at Cheney's Mews. A man called Frank White was president. So this was long before we actually decided to buy our own premises. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe they just at that period I'm not sure if they were short of money, but they perhaps just had space to get more members in. I'm not quite sure what the situation was. But anyway, I remember it being quite an easy path, although to actually get my membership, of course, you still had to do the performance. And I actually failed my first membership attempt, which is one of the few exams I failed, I think. I even passed my driving test first time, but membership at Magic Circle proved slightly harder. But that was good for me, actually. It was good to fail, really, and I put a big effort into passing the second time round.
One learns a lot from mistakes. I think if you just kind of go through life and everything is easy for you, you just don't improve. I think by entering contests and losing, you improve. You know what it was that perhaps you might need to tweak or change or whatever else. Same thing there. Do you remember what it was that you had done as far as your routine or trick or something that?
I think what I failed on was a Zarro shuffle, which was done rather badly. I do recall that, but what the rest of the act was, no, I can't actually remember what I did. I was very much into close-up at that stage, so it was definitely a close-up performance. After that, I got much more into stand-up because I sort of got into the comedy clubs in England and performed there. So, but at that stage, it was definitely.
Well, that's what I've known you most for is your stand-up comedy thing and routine. Did you have this is not the book we're going to be talking about here shortly. This is not your first book you've authored. Was there another one you had done prior to this that had to do with comedy and stand-up?
Yes, I wrote a book called Stand-Up Comedy Magic, sort of professional guide to comedy magic, which was very well received, and is quite hard to get now. Actually, I think it goes on eBay for $100. Whether, of course, people pay $100 for it, I don't know. But it's out of print. It came out about the same time, actually, as Weber's Maximum Entertainment, which he very wisely, I think, has reprinted, and therefore probably what I should have done. But I decided I did one second edition follow-up, and then I've just sort of left it. So I quite like the idea of having a book which is considered to be quite hard to get and relatively worth some money.
Kind of being like Darren Brown, I guess, huh?
Yeah, well, Darren Brown's absolutely, his first lecture notes or first book. Yeah.
Pure Effect went. I mean, they sold like about 9,000 copies, I think. But then when Darren said, "Hey, look, I'd rather people not kind of know what I'm doing because some of my secrets are in there," and apparently the first edition included some things that the subsequent editions didn't. Also.
Yes, that's correct. I actually saw Darren do that sort of first performance where he was selling that first edition, and like an idiot, I didn't buy a copy of the book. And I actually told him that it was one of the routines was too good to put in there. I don't know whether he took my advice, but certainly that was the routine that was removed for subsequent editions. Yeah. But the stand-up comedy magic I did was purely theory and how to perform. So there aren't actually any tricks in there as such. But it was well received, and
What I remember about that book, and the reason I was asking about it, because I don't think I've got that in my library. And it's one of those things, again, I should have. And that was why I was thinking I was piecing that together with you being the author, because I recall so vividly being at H&R Magic Books when they were here in Houston and visiting with Richard Hatch. And Dick was always really good, as most dealers are, brick and mortar shops, where they have a relationship with the customer and they know what you like and what kind of magic you do, and they can recommend, okay, here's something I think would be for you. And your book had just come out and he said, here's something new I think that's right up your alley, kind of thing that you need, that you would enjoy. And I looked through it and I don't remember whether I got that or not. Now I kind of regret if I haven't. I wish I would have. Sorry.
Yeah, no, Dick Hatch was a great supporter for me. Actually, I think he was the main dealer of that particular book. I knew I'd known him before, and I went to him, and he took quite a few copies. So I think he was the main person who sort of sold it initially in the States anyway.
How did that work with you being overseas and selling books internationally then? Did Dick, was he over there and he came back with him, or did you ship them? Because I know that shipping is really expensive. Foreign shipping internationally is expensive. Yes, no, I just shipped him really. I think we were on email at that stage, so I just told him about the book, and he said, send 30, 40 copies over. And if you sort of send in bulk, certainly at the time I did it, it wasn't that
it wasn't too bad. So I just sort of worked out a percentage cost, and we both agreed. I think I paid for the shipping. Always best to tell a dealer you're going to pay for the shipping.
I think you'd sell more books that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was very good. And then he just sort of ordered another 30 and then another 30. So I must have sold some like 200 to him, and then the rest I sort of sold to other dealers, but mainly off my own bat, really.
As I recall, too, and you alluded to, it had a lot to do more with theory than it did with actual routines. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I wanted to explain how to perform comedy magic, really. I was very influenced by people, particularly by Paul Daniels, slightly later by Wayne Dobson. So this idea of combining, very good comedy with very good magic, which was relatively novel, I think, at that time, certainly in this country. You were either... Comedy magicians were considered to be more sort of slapstick, sort of Tommy Cooper, where the magic wasn't, it wasn't necessarily that good. But I wanted to explain how you could do great magic and great comedy and combine the two together. I'm particularly interested in the patter, I think, of the script. That's my sort of strength, I think, if I have any strengths. And I went into how to write your own lines and the type of different lines to use. So I'm very proud of the book, and occasionally I have a look at it, and I don't think I would change very much about it. And I used a lot of examples of magicians who are sort of very much around today. I mean, people like sort of Matt King and Jeff Hobson and Michael Finney in the States. I send emails to them and asked them questions, and they gave their responses. Questions like, how did you get into comedy magic? How did you get your character? How do you come up with your lines? So those type of questions. Lots and lots of examples throughout the book of well-known comedy magicians in this country, people like Paul Daniels and John Archer, who I know you know well,
right.
John Lenahan. So, yeah.
Now, David Nixon preceded Paul Daniels, didn't he, on television on BBC?
That's correct. Yes, he did.
And yes. He wasn't quite really what I would consider a comedy magician either. He was more straightforward. I mean, he was funny, but he certainly was no Tommy Cooper.
No, I mean, some of his best routines, he's, that he is amusing. I think it's more sort of, you're sort of smiling along and sort of giggling along rather than sort of laugh out loud. You don't get anything of the sort of Paul Daniels electric chairs or, Paul Daniels' chop cup at his best,
right.
Which are real, belly laughs, I think would be fair to say. David Nixon never had that, but he had a lovely style, very laid back, little witticisms and throwaway lines that worked particularly well on television, I think, where he was very successful. I never saw him live, actually, so I wouldn't be able to sort of comment on a comparison. But
you have decided, again, not to republish the book. I mean, whenever you were saying you were adding author to your list of credits and contributions that you have been making to the Magic Fraternity, but that's just something you already were an author from before. And what year was that? I want to say that was that late 80s, early 90s?
Yeah, gosh, I could check with my book, which I got a copy of. It was probably in the 90s, I would have thought. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I would have thought in the 90s. Yeah, I mean, that was a self-published book. And then I followed that up with a book about, I used to sort of watch magicians quite a bit, and I sort of wrote out their programs and reproduced that as a book, which I called From Daniels to Derren, i.e. Paul Daniels to Derren Brown, and included sort of a lot of magicians who came over to this country. So that includes when David Copperfield came over to England and performed at Earl's Court, his one and only appearance. Well, I mean, he did follow it up the year later, but he swore after that he'd never again perform in England, which he has certainly kept to. And probably my favourite show of them all, which was Ricky Jay and his 52 Assistants, which I saw in 1999. So,
at the Old Vic?
At the Old Vic, that's quite right. Yes, at the Old Vic.
That was his 52 Assistants show?
Yes, it was 50. Yeah, that's the only one he did in England. He didn't do his follow-up shows.
On the stem, yeah.
I mean, Ricky Jay to me is my sort of number one hero. I think his combination of performing absolutely brilliant, and his writing abilities and his research and his history. He really was a lot of other magicians' hero as well, but definitely.
Yep, that's true. The book that you have recently published over here, then A Century of Deception, what is the full title and the subtitle for the book?
Yeah, this is very different, this book. I mean, just to mention one other book which I did a few years ago, which was Charles Dickens. It's on Charles Dickens as a magician, so I did that book.
Did you ever do a performance, a reproduction of his show?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did a show called The Secret World of Charles Dickens.
And dressed like him and that style, Victorian style?
I'm not an actor.
Okay.
I dressed in sort of semi-Victorian garment, but I didn't pretend to be Charles Dickens because I'm not an actor. So I recreated his tricks, but I did them in my own style. And also, talked a bit about his life and about his magic. And performed quite a few tricks which he did. So that was my sort of last book before this one. But all those books, the Stand-Up Comedy Magic, the Charles Dickens, and the Book of Programs were all self-published. But this book, I decided to go down trying to get a proper publisher for it. There's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, the full title of the book is The Century of Deception, The Birth of Hoaxes in 18th Century England.
Okay.
So to begin with, it's not directly related to magic. Obviously, it's to do with hoaxes rather than magic.
Trying to get a more of a general public interest as opposed to just a smaller niche market of magicians.
Absolutely, you've hit it spot on. I mean, I know how to sell to magicians, but it's much harder to sell to a more generalised public.
Right.
I think that was one reason. The other reason, I've been fascinated by magic history, always have been, and I really love magic history. The problem, I think, with writing books on magic history is that magic historians don't tend to explain how the tricks are done. If you look at people like Eddie Dawes or Milburn Christopher, Ricky Jay as well, David Price, whoever, all the sort of major books that have been written on magic history for the general public, none of them explain how the tricks are done because we have this sort of code that we don't. But I would question whether you can really talk properly about magic history without actually explaining how some of the tricks are done. Aren't you to really give the full picture to the general public? And I think this is one reason why I sort of thought I wouldn't do a book on magic history because I wouldn't really be able to, I might be compromising my own member of being a magic circle and all those other problems about.
Well, just for an example, if you were going to be having a book about the history of the sawing in half a woman, you have to explain the method and how it's changed because to the public, it doesn't matter what method a person is sawing in half. Period. It's over and then put it back together. I mean, it's a penetration and a putting back together the person. Anyhow, you would have to explain how that is done and how it's differed and everything. So, I understand what you're saying. So by going down the road of just explaining cons and hoaxes that were perpetrated by criminals, and for the most part, I mean, not magicians, but, has a very wide appeal.
Yeah, I think so. And just to pick up on that point, I mean, obviously Mike Keeble is doing his wonderful book, which will be out soon, I'm sure, on the history of the magic, sawing the woman in half, which of course will have lots of explanations because
Correct.
He's aiming the book at the magic community.
Right.
But interesting, I was rereading an interview by Richard Kaufman, who did with Ken Silverman, who wrote the Houdini book. Houdini,
Sure.
exclamation mark, that's the title, which in some people think is the definitive edition of Houdini. But he was saying he got a lot of flack because he wasn't explaining how any of the tricks were done. And this rather surprised him. But he also said, well, in retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. So I think that sort of brings the point forward that here was a book aimed at the general public about Houdini, and people were expecting him to explain how Houdini did some of his tricks. But he didn't because he's got a magical background.
Right.
And I think he sort of lost points for it. So that was always in the sort of back of my mind.
Interesting.
So anyway, that was part of the reason why I chose hoaxes, as you say. It's an interesting subject area, actually, because, what is the definition of a hoax? And I do distinguish between a hoax and a con or a scam. I always think a con or a scam is always money related.
Mm-hmm.
It's always trying to get money out of people, the free card trick, the free shell game, or lots of other cons which we know about.
It's playing on people's greed also.
Yeah, absolutely. But hoaxes are very rarely financially motivated. And I actually look at 10 hoaxes in my book, all from the 18th century. And only one of them is actually had a financial motivation behind it. All the others have different motivations. That's not to say that they're benign in any way. I mean, some of them are very cruel. A couple of them could have led to a couple of people being hanged as a result of a hoax. So it's not as if they're somehow much more altruistic, but they very rarely have this financial motive behind it, so I do make that sort of big distinction between a hoax and a scam.
When you're saying you don't have the financial impetus behind that, sometimes they do. In other words, it is for their own benefit, where they're not trying to scam someone else out of money so much as it is of trying to prove that they have a certain power, or they're able to do something so people will hire them. Is that, in other words, they're really not an expert in their field, but they say they are. So they'd be perpetrating a hoax in order to be hired to make money.
Yeah, well, the problem is there were so many different types of hoaxes. I mean, you could, I'll take a very well-known American example, of course, was the Orson Welles, H.G. Wells, I forgot, Mars Attack or whatever, where he did this famous radio broadcast.
Right,
and
with the Mercury Theatre.
Happening live and sort of scattered to the four corners of the United States.
Yeah, the War of the Worlds thing, right.
Yeah, whatever. The War of the Worlds, yeah, absolutely. So that was a classic hoax.
Where no one was getting hurt. There wasn't the intent for people to get hurt.
We don't even know if it was intentional either. It probably just happened by perchance rather than Orson Welles deliberately setting it up. So, there was no financial motive for that. One of the most famous hoaxes in this country, which people talk about, was one that was done on BBC television, a Panorama programme, which was the spaghetti hoax, where people thought, well, it was produced that spaghetti grew on trees.
Yeah.
And this was presented by a well-known British presenter at the time, a man called Richard Dimbleby. And because he was a very authoritative figure and people didn't know much about spaghetti at the time, a lot of people fell for it. And for me, that's a perfect hoax. It wasn't done. It had no there was no cruel element about it. Those people who were taken in by it would have enjoyed it afterwards, and those people who weren't taken in would have enjoyed it, for the sake of it. So to my mind, that is the sort of perfect sort of hoax. The problem with a lot of hoaxes that they do tend to be maybe a little bit cruel to the individual who's caught out by them. So yeah, it's a super wide area of different motivations and different reasons. I mean, obviously, I could go into one or two of my hoaxes and what the motivation was for them.
I do want to give some examples here, if you will, but yeah. I do want to ask also, why is it you focus just on the 18th century? Is it something in which you're then going to go with the 19th and 20th? I mean, there are a lot of things, even with this 20th century, the past century, that would be interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've always been quite intrigued by the 18th century. I think another interest of mine is sort of cartoons, and the earliest cartoons were what were called satirical prints, and they were sort of standalone cartoons basically, and they started emerging in the 18th century. The most famous proponent of those is William Hogarth, who I'm sure many of our listeners would have heard of, who's famous for a series of satirical engravings called The Rake's Progress, The Harlot's Progress, and Gin Lane, etc. And then there was great political cartoonists like James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson. So these are very well known in this country, and they were really prominent and burst on the scene in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. And they produced these wonderful engravings, some of which are sort of, connected with magic from time to time as well. So I've always been sort of intrigued by that. And I discovered also that often when a hoax appeared, or a well-known hoax, that somebody would produce a satirical engraving about it. So it's basically very similar to if a modern day hoax happened. You might have a cartoon in your broadsheet in the New York Times or whatever, which relates to that particular hoax. And that's exactly what happened in the 18th century. A well-known hoax would take place, and people would produce these satirical prints or engravings about them. And I found them very sort of intriguing. So it was that sort of connection between the two. And I also, there have been a lot of books written on hoaxes, both in this country and in America as well. But they just tended to be, one hoax after another. And I wanted to go into slightly more depth and concentrate on perhaps one particular period of time. And there's no doubt about it that the hoaxes in the 18th century in England were very funny and entertaining and very brilliant. I think when it comes to the 19th century, America, took over. I think the hoaxes in America are more interesting in many ways. But somehow in the 18th century in England, it did seem to kick it off. And
because people were more gullible back then?
Well, I think part of the reason it kicked off was really it's only from 1700 onwards, i.e. at the beginning of the 18th century, that we had in this country, we had a sort of exponential growth in newspapers, pamphlets, journals, satirical prints, cartoons, which I've been talking about, court transcripts, even theatrical productions. And that means that for any particular hoax that came along, there was a huge amount of information relating to it. Prior to 1700, a hoax might depend on just one piece of information, one newspaper article or one pamphlet, and therefore that information is not very reliable. So it's really only from 1700 onwards that we can see that that we have this huge amount of information about these hoaxes, so that we know what we're hearing about them is correct, if you like. Mm-hmm. So I think that's all sort of tied in with. But yeah, they were very entertaining. Whether they're more gullible now, the thesis of my book, if I have any thesis, is no, they weren't any more gullible back then. We are just as gullible now as we ever were. And I do genuinely believe that human nature doesn't change. The same reason that they fell for hoaxes in the 18th century is the same reason that we fall for them now. Just like scams and cons.
Mm-hmm. I tend to agree with that. I mean, happens every day, in particular even with today's technology, with emails and the Nigerian prince sending you an email saying, hey, we can inherit $1 million or whatever it is. I mean, people are falling for it. I mean, it's no less today gullible than, I'm sure you're right, than from before. Interesting.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true. So if I can give one example, that's the most famous example of an 18th century hoax is the one of Mary Toft, who claimed that she was giving birth to rabbits.
Okay.
It's actually mentioned occasionally in magic history books. Some people felt that actually this inspired the magician pulling the rabbit out of the hat.
Yes.
But actually the Mary Toft hoax took place in 1726, but the first performance of Rabbit Out of the Hat didn't take place till the mid-19th century. So in fact, there is no relationship between the two. So this extraordinary hoax of Mary Toft claiming she was giving birth to rabbits, which was believed by a large number of people, and she was examined by doctors, or they were called male midwives back then, who also absolutely believed that she was giving birth to rabbits. But so if I present it like that, you say, well, how could anybody be so stupid? There's no way we would believe that today. But there are actually two very good reasons why they fell for it. The first reason was there was a theory going around. It was called the theory of maternal imagination, which meant that if a woman was particularly shocked by some event, this might some way transform itself into the fetus of the child. So if a woman witnessed a beggar with no arms and she was born with an armless child, that there was considered to be a sort of direct relationship between the imagination of this woman. And Mary Toft, in her backstory, claimed that she had a great longing for rabbits. She used to eat rabbits. She worked in fields where rabbits hopped around. And therefore, there was this convincing theory that she was so obsessed by rabbits that this somehow transformed itself into her fetus.
Wow.
And a lot of doctors genuinely believed that. So that was one aspect. And the second aspect was that she was absolutely brilliant at fooling the doctors. I mean, she literally went or faked labour for up to 18 or 20 hours in sort of labour pains. She was surrounded by a large number of women who, certain of them were probably accomplices. The rabbits didn't come out whole, by the way. They came out in bits. So, at certain times she could discreetly insert parts of rabbits inside her so that they then could come out. And the doctors sort of said, well, I was there the whole time. There was no way that she could have inserted the rabbit without me noticing.
Right.
But we know that over a long period of time, with a lot of confusion, noise, and, the classic magician's misdirection, she certainly could have done it. So so if you look at it in that light, people, weren't quite as stupid as we might suppose from a 21st century perspective.
Wow. So what were some other cons or scams that people had back then?
Yeah, well, as I say, I would have to correct you on the use of the word or scams or cons and have to use the word hoax.
Okay. So there are no cons necessarily in the book. It's really more just hoaxes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, as I said to you, that's my own definition.
Yes.
I think a scam or con is directly motivated in order to get money out of people.
I understand that, but I'm just wondering if in the book your intent was to also include some of those, like a Ponzi scheme or whatever that someone had tried to.
No, I directly don't.
Okay.
I actually address that in the prologue to the book. I talk about there were various scams at the time. I mean, I'll give you a couple of classic scams back then because they are sort of unique to the 18th century. One of them was pretending that when a ship was captured and it had booty on it, the booty could be split amongst the sailors who captured the boat. So one of the scams was to pretend that you'd been a sailor on board the ship, or you were a relative of somebody who'd been aboard the ship, and therefore claim part of the booty. So that was one sort of scam. Another one was a lottery scam. Lotteries were very huge in the 18th century, and people often, came up with sort of forged tickets or pretended that they'd were deserving of a lottery prize. So they were two sort of classic 18th century scams, which were directly financially motivated. But when it comes to, hoaxes, as I say, the only one that was financially motivated actually was the one I just mentioned, the Mary Toft one, because the reason she pretended that she was giving birth to rabbits, she claimed that she was doing it for money. Now, she didn't actually receive any money, which raised the question of how was she going to make money out of this?
How was she compensated, right?
My own theory is back then, at the time of sort of famous fairs and exhibitions, and people would exhibit themselves as what they used to call monstrosities back then, so dwarfs and giants and
like a freak show.
No, absolutely, like freak shows, the sort of predecessor of the Barnum freak shows.
Yeah.
I think that was the way she was intending to make money. She would have exhibited herself as this is the woman who had given birth to rabbits. So I think. But unfortunately, the hoax was uncovered before she could actually exploit her fame in that way.
How was that uncovered? Was it because of someone who was one of her accomplices who came forward and said, well, this was what she did?
No, what happened was that she lived in, and it was initially examined in a place called Guildford in Surrey, which is about sort of 30, 40 miles from London. But two doctors came down who were associated with the royal family, with George I at the time, and they insisted on her being brought up to London to be examined by the leading male midwife of that period. And unfortunately for her, she was taken up alone. None of her accomplices were allowed to come with her. Her mother-in-law, who was heavily involved, and her husband were also excluded. So basically she was sort of left on her own, and eventually
came undone.
She came undone. The male midwife threatened to give her a very painful examination unless she confessed, at which point she it basically came out of a confession. They didn't prove that she was incapable of giving birth to rabbits.
That is
their
interesting.
medical knowledge was not good enough to be able to do that. They got it through a confession, a forced confession, and they wanted to prosecute her, but they thought the case would be too embarrassing because so many leading male midwives of the period had been caught up, and because of the association with George I, so they sent her back to her own town again, where she lived out the rest of her life.
Well, as I was doing a cursory reading over the book that you had sent in advance for me, there were about 10 different ones.
That's correct. Yes, 10 hoaxes. Yeah.
Which of those were your favorites? Well, they all were, I guess, but been there. But
now I have one particular favourite actually, and that's the bottle conjurer hoax, which took place in 1749. Which again is one that's mentioned in magic books. Eddie Dawes mentions it in his Great Illusionist book, and Ricky Jay also mentions it in his
Learned Pigs and Fireproof Women.
Yeah, I think Jay's Journal of Anomalies as well. Yep. Might have mentioned it in both of them. This is a wonderful hoax, and this is my favourite because I think it fulfills the criteria which it was basically a sort of benign hoax, although it didn't turn out that way, where essentially an advertisement appeared stating that a man would climb inside a bottle on the stage of the New Theatre, as it was called, in the Haymarket in London, and he would sing and dance inside the bottle. It was an ordinary sized bottle, by the way. It wasn't a large bottle, but he was going to sing and dance in, and the bottle could be handed out to the audience, and they could examine it and check that he was genuinely inside the bottle. So this advertisement appeared, and on the night of the 16th of January 1749, the audience was pretty much packed out. Unfortunately, although the audience turned up, the performer did not. And when they discovered it was a hoax, in true 18th century style, a riot immediately broke out, and the inside of the theatre was smashed, and they took the staging and the paraphernalia and burnt it all in a huge bonfire outside. So, and it cost the theatre owner some £400, he claimed, in damages. So, it was a hoax that didn't quite work out as it was perhaps intended to, but a wonderful hoax anyway, I think, in every way. And it was done to test the credulity of the English people at that time. So that's undoubtedly my favourite. I've done the most research on that.
And that was documented? That was something that actually happened? Because as I was reading that, like even in the prelude, then it was kind of like, well, this actually didn't happen to me. But this was...
Yes, I pretended. Yes, I won't spoil people who want to buy the book, but I sort of set it up in the prologue as if this happened to me, really to demonstrate. But I think it would still work today.
Oh, I see your point. I got it.
If somebody like David Copperfield or Dynamo or said that he was going to climb inside a bottle on the stage of a theatre, I bet they would sell out the theatre. I genuinely believe that people. I mean, they might not genuinely believe that he would climb inside a small bottle, but they would genuinely believe that the illusion could be created
to make it appear as
to make it appear so, and they would pay money to see that event happen.
Right.
I'm quite convinced of that. So I just think it's a hoax that would still work today. Absolutely. Yeah.
I interrupted you. You started to say something else about your next one, another hoax you like.
Well, I was trying to think of ones that were particularly of interest to magicians. Another one, actually, was called the Stockwell Ghost, and this is a very early example of a poltergeist at work. And it was basically a young woman called Anne Robinson, who was a maidservant, and she was working for a woman, and in the house that she worked at, the bottles started to be smashed, and bits of bacon started dropping off hooks, and water started to boil all over the place.
Wow.
Complete havoc was wreaked, and the poor woman left the house. They took all the belongings out of the house to stop them being smashed, and they moved into other houses, and exactly the same thing happened in that house. Then they moved to another house, and exactly the same thing happened. It was clearly this young maidservant who was causing all this damage. But and it only lasted about 24 hours when the maidservant was sacked, and at that point, surprise, surprise, the poltergeist disappeared. But a pamphlet was written up by all the people who'd witnessed these events, and they genuinely, were convinced that it happened by some sort of supernatural means. And but what's intriguing about it is in later life, the young maidservant actually confessed. And it's only a sort of brief, she had a conversation with another man who explained what she'd done. And she was using lots of techniques which us magicians use. I mean, she was actually using wires and threads to make the objects sort of fall over. She was actually sort of pulling on them to make the crockery and the cutlery crash to the floor. Mm-hmm. She put little sort of threads on large bits of bacon, so after a little bit of time they would break. So there was a sort of time delay. The people who were being caught out were quite elderly, so she used to sort of, when they weren't looking, she would sort of throw something over their shoulders, and they thought that the poltergeist had made it appear. But also she was very clued up, because she said part of the reason was that people exaggerated what they saw. And this is the sort of classic, this is what happens with us magicians. When the layperson explains what trick they supposedly saw, they explain something which is something we couldn't possibly have done. The playing card ended up in my wallet, in my jacket.
Exactly. There's no way that can happen, right?
But you obviously don't stop them saying that to their friends.
Yeah.
So, and that's exactly what happened here. The spectators were exaggerating what they saw, and so it's almost like she was a magician at work. It's a wonderful example of how to fool people.
And was she ever busted?
Well, I mean, she was sacked from her job, and that was the end of the matter. She then disappeared, and we really know more about it. So that was a very short-lived one. I'll give you one other example of maybe this might be more interesting to people, particularly in the US, because it involved Benjamin Franklin, mm-hmm. one of your most distinguished politicians,
right.
Inventors. Well, he really was a man of all trades, wasn't he?
He was.
Benjamin mm-hmm. Franklin, a remarkable man. And I don't know whether you know, but he was a bit of a serial hoaxer. He enjoyed hoaxing enormously. But his most famous one, which is the one I write up in my book, was called the Polly Baker speech. And this was a speech that was written up actually originally in an English newspaper, rather surprisingly, called the General Advertiser. And the speech essentially was by this young woman who was possibly a prostitute, and she was being prosecuted by the authorities for essentially fornication, or this was her 5th child, and at that time
out of wedlock,
committing fornication out of
mm-hmm.
wedlock. And she makes this wonderful speech basically saying, why are you prosecuting me? I'm a wronged woman. The man who proposed to me but then ran off. I've had all these children. I'm still bringing them up. I'm not costing the state anything. I'm paying for them. If God really didn't want me to have these children, then he would punish me. And in any way, according to you, I'm punished in the eyes of God anyway. So why are you doubling up and punishing me, twice over? And in any event, if you look to the Bible, it says at that time, breed and prosper. So I'm only doing God's word. So all this wonderful speech she makes. And at the end, with a big flourish, she says, you should be making a memorial. You should be building a statue for me. You should not be prosecuting me. So this speech came out in 1747 in this newspaper, and eventually it got over to the States. Took a couple of months to do that, and then it was reproduced in a lot of American newspapers at the time. It was picked up by a couple of sort of social historians and included in their books as an example of, the discrimination, how women were treated in New England at the time. And it was only some 40 years afterwards that Benjamin Franklin admitted that it was him who'd written the speech all the time, and it had been completely made up. So it's a fascinating, it's my example of 18th century of something going viral, if you like. It took rather longer than the internet does, but it was the equivalent. It appeared in one English newspaper, it then appeared in lots of other new English newspapers, and then it travelled across to the United States and appeared in lots of newspapers there as well. So yeah.
So the woman never even existed. He made up the whole story.
Never existed. No,
okay.
It was a completely made up story.
Well, it sounds like the lady with the Scarlet A. Was that Hawthorne who wrote that? So it sounds like he came up with the story before that was out. So he made up the whole thing. That was interesting. So
yeah, I mean, he made up quite a few stories which he used to, because he was editor of the Pennsylvania Gazette, I think it is, and as editor, if he was a bit short of copy, he would make up a few stories. So he was quite used to making up stories. But this is the one that, yeah, his most famous and longest lasting one, I think.
Have there been some stories that you have heard in later centuries, let's say the 19th and 20th, but not enough really to make a book? Or are there some things that you are kind of put in the back of your mind and thinking, well, I'll add to that, there might be something again down the road?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure I could do a book on the 19th century hoaxes and the 20th century hoaxes. I think I'll just have to see how this book goes. I mean, this is a completely new area for me because obviously I don't know whether it's true in the States, but if you want to get a book published by a proper publisher as opposed to self-publishing. By the way, I'm nothing against self-publishing. A lot of people said to me, you were mad to go through a publisher. You should self-publish. You're likely to make much more money, which is probably true. But in order to get a book published over here, you have to have an agent. So it's hard enough to get an agent who's interested in your work. And then you have to put a proposal forward. So the agent has to accept it. And then the agent obviously has to approach publishers to determine whether they want to publish the book. So whether or not I would be able to do a follow-up would be wholly dependent, I think, on how successful this book is. If it sells well, then obviously the next step would be to somebody to say, well, do you want to do one on 19th century hoaxes?
Right.
Whether I'd want to or not is a different matter. I mean, my first love is still magic, so I would almost prefer to do something which was more magician-related rather than necessarily hoax related.
Well, it's much like I think any other author, if their book is popular, I should say, just like movies, I guess. If something comes out and it's a hit, then everybody wants to do a movie like that. And same thing, there probably hasn't been any other books about hoaxes, but if this takes off, then others might want to jump on that proverbial bandwagon and do something. Plus, the publisher will say, look, I'm going to throw a lot of money at you, but yeah, put something together because they're loving this and they want more. That would be the advantage of having a publishing house doing this for you as opposed to being it self-published. However, if being self-published, it's still caught fire, you could have then publishers come to you saying, hey, this book was brought to our attention, we would like to represent you. But now you already have that representation, and a publisher, again, they may be the ones who will push you to doing future books if this one sells well for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, actually, just in the book, my agent, we didn't sell the publishing rights to the US. It's only UK and the rest of the world, but not North America. And so the agent is still, because I wrote to him and said, what does that actually mean? He said, well, if the book is successful in England, then maybe he could then approach a US publisher and say, would you be interested in publishing it? So at the moment, it's not available, for instance, on Amazon.com. It's only available on Amazon.co.uk as a book, although it will be available as an e-book as well as a hard copy. So when it comes to anybody in the United States wanting to buy the book, probably best to go down the e-book route rather than the hard back book, where I know from experience the cost of postage is about the same as the cost of the book. As
we were saying, yes, foreign shipping is relatively expensive unless you have something to Amazon and they actually print them here and they have copies in the U.S. and they can ship them from here as well. Do you have a copy of the book? I mean, a hard copy there as well? You can show what the cover looks like?
Yes, indeed. Yes. There we go.
Oh.
That's it. It was literally arrived on Monday. So, and we're giving this talk on Friday. So 4 days ago, I actually got it. It's got some great endorsements from a couple of magicians which I'll read out. Darren Brown very kindly said, utter joy, a delicious romp through the heyday of balderdash and grand-scale deception penned by one of the country's finest magical minds. I can't tell you how much I had to pay him for that quote. Andy Nyman, Ian Keable's brilliant book has opened my eyes to an incredible world of hoaxes and deceivers that I didn't know even existed. And Richard Wiseman, who many of you might know, a masterful and fascinating journey into a hitherto hidden world of history, mystery, and hoaxes. So some wonderful quotes from these three magicians, which are obviously prominently on the back cover,
right,
as you might anticipate. So this is it. It's illustrated as well with the sort of satirical hoax prints that I was talking about earlier.
That looks, very good, and that'd be look good on someone's shelf. But more importantly, I think it looked good in their hands reading.
Well, I think so. I mean, it's an interesting crossover, I think, from into magic. Not a direct relationship, but to say, I think 2 or 3 would be of particular interest to magicians, but I would hope they would enjoy the other ones as well. It's written deliberately as a fun read.
How long did it take you to research and then to write it out? I'm going to guess it must have taken 5, 6, 7 years.
No, it was shorter than that.
Really?
I put the proposal together, and the way you do non-fiction is you put a proposal together without writing the book, and then when you've got the publishing deal, they then give you so long to write it, and they gave me basically a year to write it.
Oh.
So I knew what hoaxes I was going to do. I mean, quite a lot of them have been written about previously, so they were relatively well known. But 2 or 3 of them, there wasn't that much information on them that I had to sort of research from scratch.
So it wasn't like you took some paper or some documents to publisher saying, here's what I've got, I'm looking for you to publish it. It was more just an outline, and you shopped that around until someone said, yep, we want it, write it, and you got a year. That was interesting.
That's normal, certainly in this country, for non-fiction. If you're writing a book of fiction, then you have to write the whole book, because obviously they want to see, you might have a wonderful beginning, but they want to see whether it works to the end. But for publishers, no. For non-fiction, you tend. I mean, what I wrote was the first chapter and the prologue, and that we submitted, and then you have an outline of all the other 9 chapters, and the reason for that is that publishers will often want to make changes. They'll say, so if you present everything, then it's much harder for them to make changes, if you like. But if you say, look, they might say, oh, I don't want 10 hoaxes, I want 20 hoaxes, or I want less hoaxes, or or I want you to concentrate on different type of hoaxes than you've chosen. We want to concentrate on literary hoaxes rather than more generalized hoaxes. So, yeah. But as it was, I had a wonderful relationship with my publisher. They got the book straight away, and the changes which they suggested were all for the good. I mean, they made the book better. So I was very lucky in that respect.
Did you go back and forth with them as far as where you had the final say as to what was going to be going in, or were they making the suggestions, well, how about if you redo this? I mean, were they going line by line or just kind of by concept, or how close were they looking over your shoulder?
No, that basically, I was looking actually at the timetable the other day. The publication date was put off a year because of COVID. But essentially, yeah, I think it was January 2019. I got that right? Maybe no, it must be January 2020. Originally, it was going to be we want the finished work by January 2020, and then we're published in sort of October that year. But it's been put back another year. But anyway, I presented my manuscript. I decided I wouldn't present it bit by bit. I would present it as one lump. Because I just didn't want, them making changes as I went along. So I presented as one lump, as agreed, at the end of January 2020. And they read it, and a couple of the chapters they wanted changes, which I made. So there was quite a big rewrite of a couple of chapters. I actually cut it down to 9 chapters because of the word count. I said I wanted. But they then later came back and said, no, we want another chapter. We want a 10th chapter. So I had to write an additional chapter. It was also sent to an editor who made a number of suggestions, again, which I took on board. So, yeah, I think I rewrote 3 chapters quite considerably, but the rest they were broadly happy with.
So are you enjoying writing more than performing, or are you anxious to get back and do some more performing, or you want to continue doing both?
Yeah, I've always said that my dream would be to earn money sitting at my desktop.
Okay.
And in actual fact, ironically, the pandemic has actually made that dream come true, because not only have I been writing, but also I've been doing Zoom, doing things by Zoom, like the equivalent of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I do quite enjoy that. I do more talks than magic shows as such, although some of my talks are magic related. And that's done via Zoom on the whole. But of course, it's now creeping back. I'm going to have to go out onto the road again.
Well, when you do these speeches, when you're like for corporate audiences and everything, you incorporate magic a little bit, or?
Yeah, I actually don't do corporate shows. My talks tend to be for sort of social groups and other organisations. The equivalent of something like, I was trying to think in America, you have Rotary, don't you?
Yes, we do. Rotaries and Lions and Elks and
that type
fraternal
of
organization, sure.
Yeah, that type of organisation is I do the equivalent of over here. So it's more for that. So they're more fun and entertaining talks rather than corporate, salesmanship BS talks, as I would call them. I mean, magician's ability to sell,
right.
sell, emotional skills through their magic. It never ceases to amaze me, but I haven't got the sort of, the confidence to do that, I don't think.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and talking about this book. And for people who are wanting to get a copy of that, either, perhaps in the U.S. it might be easiest, again, with a PDF or something. Is there a website where they can go to order it, or through Amazon if they want a hard copy, or where can they find this?
The best starting point actually is centuryofdeception.com. So that's all one word, centuryofdeception.
The Century or just Century?
Just Century.
Centuryofdeception.com.
Century of Deception, obviously, HTTPS, but I think if you just put in centuryofdeception.com. This is actually a website that I created myself because rather unusually, the book doesn't actually have any notes in it because it would just would have been so many pages of notes. So what I've done is I've created a website which has all the notes for the book, but also it gives you information about the book and where you can buy it, which is either direct by the publisher or by Amazon or by other well-known bookshops in this country. But I think the best starting place is, centuryofdeception, all one word, .com.
And as we close, also, of course, the name of my podcast is called The Magic Word. I always like to ask my guests what it is that is your philosophy of life. What do you live by? What is your word or words?
Oh, wow. Philosophy of life. I hadn't seen that one coming.
Yeah, when you wake up in the morning, what is it that gives you joy? What are you looking for?
There's so I'm sort of digress when I think of an answer. That the Magic Circle has occasionally Marvin Burgess gives a sort of 5-minute talk to new magicians, and he always asks them at the end to give 3 words that describe themselves. And I always think that's a tough one. So you're coming up with rather the equivalent there. What gets me up in the morning? What gets me? I don't know. I'm not I'm not a spiritual person or a philosophical person. I don't think I'm somebody who is. I enjoy being busy and doing things that I like to do. So at the moment, I've got plenty on apart from promoting this book. I'm also working on a manuscript of another book as well, which I've been working for over a year. This is actually to do with magic. Unfortunately, I can't reveal what it's about at this time, but I've been editing somebody else's work, somebody who died a few years ago. So that's taken up a lot of my time, and Zoom talks. So I guess I'm driven by having something to do, I think, if that isn't a little bit feeling a bit feeble.
No.
That's an answer.
Nope, that sounds fine. No, that's good. No, appreciate that. That's good.
I'm not. I can't give you a Jeff McBride.
That's fine.
More of a sort of magical, spiritual answer.
Well, it's been a joy. I thank you very much. I've appreciated the time we've had here together. So.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Scotty, for agreeing to talk about this. I really appreciate it.
Certainly, and I wish you the best with this book, and look forward to getting a chance to see you maybe in Blackpool this next year.
Yes, could be. You never know.
Yeah, we don't know what's happening. That's true.
We have just no idea what's going to happen. No,
exactly.
No.
All right, and so until next time, that was Ian Keeble, and this is Scotty out. Thank you, Ian. That was great. I appreciate you giving us the insight on your new book. Thank you also for contributing this new book to the magic community and to the community at large. I guess the general public, I think, would find this to be quite interesting then as well. So, again, thanks for sharing your time with us and letting us know about this. I also want to let everybody know that this next week, of course, I'm going to be going to Columbus, Ohio for the Magi Fest, which is going to be, I understand, not only live, but also there will be a virtual component of that convention then as well. I'll be presenting 3 days, all 3 days. That's going to be September the 16th, 17th, and 18th as the convention dates. And so, of course, by the time that each day is completed, I will have uploaded that day's worth of material, which you will then hear the following day or sometime shortly thereafter, I guess, after the day of the events. But again, during that time of the convention, I'll be talking with the organizers, some of the talent, the registrants, the dealers, just a little bit of giving you a taste of what it was like at the convention for those of you who can't attend. And for those who are attending, you'll be able then to go back and listen to some of the conversations perhaps that you may have missed with some people you would like to have talked with or heard from. So please come back and join us. And also you can subscribe to our pod letter. That way you're kept up to date on what's going on all the time here at the Magic Word. And whenever we have contests from time to time, you'll be the one of the first to know because we put that in our pod letter then as well. I will also say that as a result of the convention reports that will be coming out daily, I will not be releasing a podcast at its normal time. That is, typically we release these podcasts at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time in America. That's GMT -5. And then next week we will not be dropping this podcast at our regular time, but it will be coming out later again after we've actually had a day's worth of activity. So that will be coming out probably later that night on Thursday night, maybe early Friday morning to give you some of the overview of the activities. There again, that will not be a full convention day, but rather just a half day of activities that begins sometime around noon on Thursday. But leading up to that, I'll be talking with several people, and it'll be a full convention report of that half day, which will seem as if it's a full day. Anyhow, you get the general idea. So, until next week, stay well, get booked, and remember to find what moves you and stay driven. This is Scotty out.